All right, so it's my great pleasure to moderate the next panel, which is called New Forms of Political Diaspora Engagement. And we have three fantastic panelists with us who will look at these different forms of political diaspora engagement from different perspectives, which I also find quite complementary. So I hope you will too. So the program has been a bit changed as compared to what you have in front of you. We will start with Nora Yasmin Ragab, who will talk about, the title has changed as well, urban spaces as arenas of transnational activism, Arab diasporas, and political mobilization in Berlin. Then we will hear Thomas Fibiger from Denmark, and his paper is called Silencing the Voice of Bahrain, Bahrain's London Diaspora and Media Activism. And finally, we will end with Thibaut Jolin from Sciences Po here, who will talk about external voting in Arab countries. So you will have 20 minutes each, and I will be keeping the time. Nora, the floor is yours.
Yes, thank you very much also for the opportunity to talk today. Thanks to the organizers for inviting me. So yeah, my title changed a bit. So today, my presentation, I really want to focus on urban centers as critical site of diaspora mobilization. And we heard about it also today, that new identities, social and political, are being kind of reconstructed in this era. And also we heard about a city which came up, I think, at least 3 times today, which was Berlin. So my focus today is on Berlin as a site of transnational activism. Here I look specifically at the post-Arab revolution diasporas, the diverse diasporas. I want to explore how Berlin became a center for this activism. But I also want to connect it to more historic diasporas. And here I will look at the Palestinian diaspora and to see also how both the city can be a site of liberation and revolution as much as a site of repression. And I also want to understand how actually diaspora groups reshape and reclaim urban spaces. And I base this analysis a bit on my PhD research, which I did on Syrian diaspora mobilization, as well as some empirical research on Palestinian diasporas, as well as on some readings and my own lived experience and embodied knowledge. So work? I don't think. Yes. And we can move already to the second slide. So looking, and I will also base it a bit on Ali Ambro's reading, who explored quite a lot how Berlin became the center or the capital of Arab intellectual life. And what we indeed saw since 2011, actually, that even though we could imagine it might be London or Paris as kind of historical cities of Arab diaspora mobilization, it became actually Berlin that became the center. And what we could see actually that there have been a surge in Arab-speaking events, in conferences, in cultural practice, in parties, in raves, in cultural festivals. And these spaces were political and culturally and politically and kind of brought back kind of the narratives of the revolution, the practices of the revolution, but also created a space where the different activists from the region could meet and reimagine kind of some of the Arab futures. So the city of Berlin became kind of a sanctuary for political activism of post-revolutionary Arab diasporas. And I found this also in my research when I looked actually at Syrian civil societies, and especially actually Syrian civil society groups or initiatives that emerged from the revolutions or within the neighboring countries and then traveled with the founders to Berlin. So actually Berlin provided a space of a transnationalization of the Arab revolution as well. So when we think about why Berlin became a center for the Arab exiles, we can think about 3 different factors or spaces, and we talked about political opportunity structures already in the beginning that kind of promoted the the evolution of a post-Arab revolutionary diaspora. So on the one hand, we can think about the national politics of Germany. Of course, as many knew, Germany had quite an open and self-proclaimed welcoming approach to the so-called refugee crisis. So this, of course, led also to migration specifically towards Germany, but also it had a quite open foreign policy stance. And I think this is also something very important. So the foreign policy stance of Germany resonated quite a lot with the narratives and the activities of the Arab exiles. But then we have also to look at local policies because, okay, it could be also Munich, but it didn't, it wasn't Munich where people settled, it became Berlin. And here it was also kind of very local policies that on the one hand provided access to lobby, for example, the German government, but also very local policies such as promoting a free cultural scene, which specifically under the former cultural senator, who invested quite a lot in more alternative cultural practices, favored also the merging of these more cultural spaces. But Ali Amro also points out to the specific nature of Berlin, the specific history of Berlin, who has historically been actually a place of refuge, a sanctuary city. It has been a place where, for example, Protestant minorities, Jewish, other intellectuals, homosexuals, activists, political activists from Turkey, for example, all find a space where they can express and engage in both transnational but also local struggles. So here emphasize that the specific nature, the nature of Berlin being a laboratory of both cultural but also political encounters, made also the city very attractive to people who fled very repressive countries and find kind of a liberation in the context of Berlin. But another point, which is also very important, is actually the presence of a historic Arab and specifically a Palestinian diaspora, which kind of created spaces which kind of favored a home in exile. And I want to go to the next slide. Yes. And I want actually to illustrate this by reading out the quote from an Iraqi poet, Nada al-Khawam. And she said, "My experience in Berlin is different from any other. Even after 3 years of getting to know the city and living in it, I'm still a stranger to it. These years would have been unbearable if it was not for the Arab-speaking communities that transformed the city with oriental charm, especially the Sonnenallee known as the Arab Street. There you can hear Fayrouz and Rahbani music every morning, mixed with a coffee brewed with coffee brewed over hot sand. The various Arab dialects tickle your ears. There's the smell of bread and delicious Arab sweets. The company of old friends you met on a sidewalk in Berlin, where you share the experience of exile, a cup of cardamom tea, the concerns of the East, and the details of the city. All this breathes life back into the lifeless body. Often the details reveal the burden of exile. So I think it's also interesting when we look at the emergence of diaspora mobilization, how they actually connect also to kind of historical presence. And by this presence, there's the creation of a sense of home and this kind of relief of the burden of exile. And when we talk about the historic presence of Arab diasporas, we need, in Berlin specifically, we need to explore Palestinian communities. And again, it's the wrong side. Sorry. And their history actually in Berlin. So Germany is actually known to be the capital, the country with the biggest Palestinian diaspora. We don't know actually exact how many Palestinians live in Germany because Palestine does not exist as a category. So I think official numbers would say that there are 800 Palestinians in Berlin, but actually, estimate think that there are around 45,000 Palestinians living in Berlin. So Berlin is actually believed to be the center also of the Palestinian diaspora. It's also interesting when we think about the histories of migration, which are, of course, quite distinct. So the majority of Palestinians in Berlin came during the civil war in Lebanon. There have been, of course, Palestinian migration before, students and workers and political exiles, but in the context of Berlin, this group actually represents the biggest one. And it's quite interesting how they came, because it was quite an easy journey. So Palestinians from Lebanon usually took a flight from Beirut to East Berlin, because again, the Eastern Berlin government had quite good connections to the PLO. So the entry was easy to allow, but while the PLO fraction elite often became a refugee visa, the ordinary people were sent further to West Berlin. So they actually embarked on a metro and could easily then access West Berlin, because West Berlin didn't want to accept the inner German borders, so there was also not much of a kind of check. In West Berlin then, however, even though the journey was quite easy, Palestinians were not recognized as political refugees, and this meant that they actually got a Duldungsstatus. It was a tolerated status, where you didn't have the right to work, and you didn't had, in certain instances, even not the right to pursue higher education. So there was a policy which created quite a lot of marginalization of specifically the older generation of Palestinians who migrated during the 90s. The Duldungsstatus meant that you had to apply for a new status every 3 months. And it created kind of also a forced inactivity, but this led also actually to quite a vibrant kind of small businesses around the Sonnenallee, which actually then the city became the street became famous for. Also now looking at the space of political mobilization compared to the Arab revolutionaries or post-revolutionary Arab diasporas, the political space of mobilization for Palestinians historically has been very closed. This, of course, is due to the unique history of Germany in relation to Israel, but also, especially in the 70s, when there have been the attacks on the Munich Olympia team, actually this meant that there was kind of, the Palestinian figure became quite visible and connected to a threat and terrorism, and it meant quite a lot of repression. So Palestinian student organizations and worker organizations in Germany were banned. There was also threats to deportation, or not only threats, but unlawful deportation of quite a lot of families. And it affected also quite the older generation, as this meant kind of the whole repression and discrimination meant that most actually stayed less visibly and less engaged in the politics when it comes to Germany. I look at the time, still okay. And so Sarah El-Boubesi, who was a Palestinian researcher, and she researched actually Palestinian diasporas and also the different generations of Palestinian diasporas, said that the taboo is so powerful that not only the experience of violence suffered by Palestinians, but also Palestinians per se become something socially condemned. So it was really something impossible to talk about, and continues to be quite impossible to talk about in the German context. And, one more, yeah, this one. So now we have the overview of the kind of both diaspora groups, and we already heard also about October the 7th as maybe another kind of transformative event. And indeed, why Palestinian groups or the Palestinian diaspora in Germany had a historical kind of experience of repression and attempts also to make them invisible, the 7th of October can be still perceived as a transformative event that turned the space of Berlin as a space for revolution and liberation to a space of repression. And so what we saw actually that in response to 7th of October, but also, of course, Palestinians trying to take the street, there has been an increase of suppression of the protests, but also cultural symbols and voices and narratives. And this repression is enacted to very different mechanisms, legally, politically, and culturally. I won't get into detail too much because this could mean it fills another presentation. But what is important actually to see that it really influenced not only Palestinians, and I will talk about it in a bit, but also the city and the experience of a city as a whole. So protests were banned, and if demonstration took place, they have been met often with massive police violence and arrests. Cultural events have been cancelled. Individuals or groups who were advocating for Palestinian rights have been subject to smear campaign, defunded, or there were a lot of job terminations as well. So in Berlin, initially a space of refuge, a site where activists and Arab exiles, artists, and intellectuals could organize politically, express dissent against authoritarian regimes, actually then become a city or turned into a space of policing, silencing, and emotional dislocation. And I think which is really important because those of the activists who actually experienced the repression on the streets in Cairo, in Damascus or Tunis, actually were re-traumatized by this police violence because there was also this expectation that Germany could at least be a quite safe space to express, no? So for many Arab exiles, the repression signaled kind of also precarity of their own political and cultural presence. And this repression or criminalization also reveals kind of a conditioned nature of Arab diasporic belonging in Germany. So your political refuge or your political agency is kind of contingent upon the adherence to the state discourse or historical memory and geopolitical alignment. And this kind of led also to emotional dislocation, but an exile within an exile. And I won't have the time to touch upon the transformations in Syria, but it's also interesting because for many, actually, this meant that Germany, which is increasingly becoming not a safe space to live, then Syria still maybe holds a potential future. But what I also want to emphasize, and I pointed out in my last quote, is, and here you see actually a picture from a demonstration in Berlin where a street was renamed to Mahmoud Darwish Street. And I think this is something which you can also see. So despite the repression, there's also reclaiming of a space and also kind of counteracting the repression. So there have been demonstrations, cultural events, film screenings, teach-ins, everything you can mention since the last 16 years, and it still continues. You see graffitis of Palestine, but often also slogans which connect Palestine to the revolutions in the Arab world. So you can see that there is still also resistance and a reclaiming and reshaping of the system, of the city. So despite the fact that the city turns kind of into a space of repression, diasporas also show a lot of agency to challenge this and to claim the urban space through the cultural production, political organizing, and also grassroots resistance. Yes, I'm coming to my conclusion when I go in the right. Yeah, and I want to actually highlight this was one quote of a Palestinian filmmaker, Pari El-Kalkili, because I think it shows quite a lot that even despite the very repressive space of Palestinian diasporas and also the hardship they faced economically, that there is a continuous also kind of mobilization organizing. So she said on a protest, actually, we Palestinians here in Berlin are the daughters, sons, grandchildren of the survivors of the Nakba. Palestinians, whether in Palestine, Lebanon, Jordan, Syria, or in the diaspora, have witnessed the ongoing Nakba for generations. But we always have stood up again. And here, Berlin, too, we have stood up time and time again when they denied us education and work, issued chain toleration, banned our association, took away our spaces, criminalized our protest, arrested us, and threatened us with deportation. We Palestinians stood up again, and again we are doing so still today. So, sorry. So to conclude, actually, I want to highlight that cities are never static places of settlement, but they are dynamic arenas where transnational identities and solidarities and political practice are actively forged and contested. And when I examine both post-Arab revolution diasporas, but also the historical diaspora mobilization, kind of reveals this duality as a site, Berlin as a site of freedom and liberation, versus Berlin as a site of marginalization and repression. And this, of course, continues to be shaped by evolving political and social dynamics. So diaspora actors play an active role in reclaiming, reshaping, and reconfiguring urban spaces through cultural practice, politics, political protest, but also everyday interactions.
Thank you very much, Nora. Now I'm giving the floor to Thibaut Jolin, who will talk about external voting in Arab countries.
Okay. Can you hear me? Yeah. Better that way. So thank you for inviting me at the CAREP. Has been a while I didn't come here. I have disclaimers also too. The first one is I'm not at least anymore a researcher, so you know I a bit unprepared. I do a bit of time out of my free time, but that was not a lot, and so. If it's a bit clumsy and disorganized, this is just because, you know, has been a long time since I didn't presented these research. The other one is, I mean, it's like the consequence of the first one. It's that it's a research that I did a really long time ago, even before yours. So it was part of a Marie Curie Fellowship from 2013 to 2015. And it's basically, I mean, there were a couple of publications, but it's basically a paper that was published in 2016. So this is almost 10 years ago. Still, when Isabelle proposed that I present this research to you, I thought it's, I mean, the contact, of course, it's outdated, etc. You'll see, but still, the methodology somehow is, I think, still interesting. And so the title is External Voting in Arab Countries. Actually, I will give a bit of overview about this in the beginning, but mostly I will present the research conducted on the election that took place in Tunisia in 2011, 2014, and external elections, so election that took place in France and in other extraterritorial constituencies, as it's called. So just to come back to maybe external voting, and I realized, so I took a definition that is from Jean-Michel Lafleur. He was one of the first, and in the 2000s, they were, you know, like developing interest for external voting, which is, you know, diaspora participating in the election of their country of origin, basically. And Jean-Michel Lafleur was one of the first to try to come up with a definition. What I think is important is that definition is active and passive voting rights. It means not only that you can vote, but you can be a candidate also. Qualified individual, it means that it's not just because your great-great-grandfather, you know, was from an Arab country and you don't have the citizenship that then you can vote. It's really for nationals. And then independently of their professional status, this is because for a long time, external voting was only for, let's say, member of the embassies or militaries abroad, etc., to take part from outside of the country, of the national territory, in a referenda, supranational, national, etc., different type of election, in a country of which they hold citizenship and where they permanently and temporarily do not reside. So it's not for people traveling abroad. It's for, you know, one or more of these elections that are listed here. And all this matters because you can find, you know, example of people voting in an election of their country of origin, but does not, let's say, match these criteria, and then it's not really external voting. What was important in publication that were made on external voting in these let's say in the 2010 is that we realized that research showed that practicalities of external voting were super important, depending on, you know, who was entitled to vote or not, and it depends on not only, of course, citizenship, but also how much time you've been living in a country, in which country you live. A country who would organize an election abroad could decide, for example, that it's possible to vote, I don't know, in Paris, you know, in the Paris, in the consulate in Paris, but not, for example, in Brussels, because there are not enough member, let's say, the diaspora is too small there to justify to organize an election. So the place where you vote, but also how ballots are casted. If you go and cast a ballot in the, you know, in the consulate, or if you vote by proxy, or if you vote electronic voting, etc. And of course, all this has a matter on participation and the results. How the votes are counted also. If you vote for the parliamentary election, depending if there's electoral consistency and you elect your own deputy somehow, your own representative, or the votes of the diaspora, you know, a mix up was you know, in of the votes of the person in the country, and all this have an impact. So there's a lot of, you know, there was a lot of discussion on these matters at that time. Was a lot of also discussion on, you know, like normative or theoretical dimension of external voting. Rainer Boberg, you know, was one who really reflected, I think, the most of how external voting, along with the emphasizement on um, uh, um, sorry, it's not non-resident citizenship, non-citizens residents, so foreigners in a country where, you know, entitled to vote. So that was one, you know, so the practicalities of external voting, the normative or theoretical aspect of external voting, and also, there were a number of, and I will discuss a bit of this, of research on the diffusion of external voting. Because, I mean, from, let's say, a couple of countries in the world in the early 1990s, 10 or 20 years later, you had more than 100 countries that had emphasized their citizens abroad and would allow external voting. And the last, let's say, trend of research that we're conducting on that, and this is the bulk of what I will be presenting, is political behavior of the diaspora, of the in external election. And this, of course, echoes a lot what has been said previously in relation with, you know, political remittances, what is called political remittances, or, you know, the impact of how you are socialized in a country. Does it impact what you think, what your political stances, etc. So this is just, you know, I tried to update that list. I think it's not super, probably there's a bunch of mistakes, but it gives you an overview of a country who allow external voting among in the League of Arab States, and those who do not, or where it's, you know, not applicable because there's no election. It's basically from my own data and from International IDEA, who has a database on external voting with quite a lot of interesting data, but sometimes, you know, either outdated or wrong, etc. What you can see, and I think we could, you know, highlight is the first country who allowed external voting were those from North Africa, Arab countries. And I saw, Isabel, that you put in the list of in the bibliography of the conference, the book by Laurie Brandt, who really looked at that and how authoritarian states, and in echoes Gerasimos, your illiberal paradox, you know, of authoritarian state when they try to reach out to the diaspora. So Algeria, Morocco, and Tunisia in the 70s and 80s extended the franchise to their diaspora, not out of democratic concern, obviously, but because it was a way to legitimate their the regime, you know, at that moment. Then in the 90s and 2000, let's say that the rationale between was quite different, because it was a time, you know, where, I mean, first I mean, the diffusion of external voting echo a more democratic concern, or let's say a general atmospheres in that period where, you know, country or the international community was hoping that more and more country would become democratic. And it's important, I think, to highlight, for example, that countries like Iraq or Sudan, you know, for the referendum on the independence of South Sudan in 2011, and others, external election were organized, you know, under the umbrella of international organization. And so UNDP, UN, IOM, UNHCR played a role in a number of cases among in Arab countries or in other countries, in Africa in particular, to organize external elections. I think this is important because when I think of Syria, so of course, you know, Bashar extended the franchise to Syrians abroad in 2014, and then again in the forthcoming election. But it was, I mean, okay, it echoes actually the rationale of you know what Algeria and North African country did in the ITs. But the point is that with the number of Syrian refugees, you know, and if hopefully there's an election that is held in Syria at a certain point, the question of should Syrian refugees that have not decided to come back be allowed to vote will be important. And certainly this is something that yeah. So I'm time flies. So I'll stop here on this. Just, yeah, so the list, I think, I'm not sure if it's 100% right, might be a couple of mistakes, but basically an interesting case I'd like to mention is Jordan. In some cases, because it echoes situation of other countries where, because the diaspora, you know, and it's not really the case of Jordan, but the problem is kind of the same. When the diaspora outnumbers the population, you know, in the home country, then you really have an issue about, you know, who controls the sovereignty at the end of the country and who rules the country. So in the case of Jordan, it's you know, a bit more complex than that, but still the question remains somehow the same. Lebanon, obviously, you know, was also a similar case where the question of the impact of the diaspora on the politics, internal politics, would be important. This is the list of countries that have adopted external voting, but implementation is another story, and would need more time that I had, you know, to work on it and present proper results. So what I would do is just show you another work that I did in on Africa with a colleague that was working on the same thematic, Etienne Smith. So this is a 2015 article that was published in French, and we had a map of, you know, the adoption of external voting in African countries. So, you know, there were basically three waves. The first one before 1919, then in the 90s, and then since 2000. But what was important is there's this map of the adoption of external voting, and then there were this maps, you know, of the implementation of external voting. And when you look at it carefully, you see that adoption does not necessarily mean implementation, not to speak of, well, let's say, fair or democratic or broad adoption that would really allow citizens abroad to participate. I would have loved to speak about, norm diffusion of external voting and how colonial legacy, has an impact on countries that would, but I don't really have a lot of time to do that. So I just go to my case study, which is, the 2011 and 2014 Tunisian election abroad. Tunisia was an interesting case study for me when I did that research because external voting existed since 98, and the first, the plebiscite for Ben Ali, but it continued, when the regime after the authoritarian turn would still organize election and would actually put a lot of effort and money into, creating polling station abroad, a lot of it, even if Tunisian diaspora wouldn't participate in much into that election, or just to show, as Gerasimos was mentioning, it was like an event, just demonstration of do you follow or not the regime. But the thing is that after the uprising, there were this, let's say, this legacy, of Ben Ali's regime has an impact because it was obvious for everybody, the diaspora certainly, but even in Tunisia, for all the parties, that the diaspora would be allowed to participate in the election for the Constituent Assembly. And it was even obvious for everybody that hadn't been really discussed that, the number of representatives for the diaspora and the parliament would in the Constituent Assembly would be kind of fair, or you would represent, the estimated number of voters abroad. So 6 overseas constituencies were created with 18 representatives. And actually the first election in 2011 showed quite, high turnout, was more than 2,000 voters. But then it it really collapse. Decreased by half in 2014 and steadily, were decreasing afterwards. And the important also legacy of Ben Ali's regime is what I was mentioning, the great number of polling stations created abroad, of course, in consulate, embassies, and, like Tunisia, like other Arab countries, would have cultural centers for the diaspora. So that were state-sponsored cultural centers. So there, but also in public, venue, French public venue, like schools, or town halls, etc., that would be led for free to the Tunisian authorities. It changed in 2000. Okay, in 22. Okay, so the new regime would, decrease the number of representative and constituencies. So now it doesn't has the same meaning that it had at that moment. What I did, and so I took too much time. What I did at that period, and this is so in the 5 minutes that I left, what I like to highlight is I tried to look. The question was, how is the diaspora is voting? Is the voting behavior of the diaspora the same that the Tunisian in the country? So the first result was, of course, the political landscape changed and parties disappeared, others were created. So, but the conclusion were, first of all, the trends between these two elections were almost the same. So Nahda, the Islamist party, won the first election, lost the second one. But the voting behavior at home and abroad, let's say, were quite the same. But there were some differences when it comes to middle-sized or small-sized parties, okay? And it can have to do with the number of candidates that you're able, to send abroad, campaigning abroad also, which is in itself a huge issue. The other thing that I try to do is that, I try to map, like, this old thing for electoral studies when you do electoral maps. So I try to have maps of electoral behavior, in these 6 external constituencies, which were France 1, the north of France, France 2, the south, then Italy, Germany, and then a constituency for Arab countries, and the last one a bit weird, which was like Americas and the rest of the world, so basically North America. And the thing again that was interesting is that actually the political behavior were quite consistent from one election to another, but it was very clear. A question that was a bit here at that time was to what extent, being socialized in a liberal Western country would have an impact of your voting behavior. And I mean, this showed that actually not much, or not in the way we think, because, Tunisian in Italy and Germany would have much stronger preference for Nahda than Tunisian in France or in the US. Why? Why so? So, there were no, like the regime in which they were living couldn't explain this. So why so? And I mean, so in this paper, I tried to argue that actually what matter are more pre-migration variables. So, the migration as a selective process. So when you migrate, it's not everybody that can migrate everywhere. And so, of course, actually, Tunisian communities in France or in Italy or in Germany are not the same. And these, socioeconomic characteristics that they have then can explain their political behavior. And I have, I guess, only 1 minute, so I'll show you this. And that was the one thing that was really fun to do, because thanks to this high number of polling stations in the Ile-de-France, I could map the political behavior of the Tunisians in the Ile-de-France. And I mean, for those who know Ile-de-France, the Parisian region, you can see that it actually reflects, the voting preferences. So more red, it's more in favor of Ennahda, and more orange is more in favor of the opponent to Ennahda. So you could see that actually reflect the socioeconomic differences that and characteristic that we have within the region, like inner city versus suburb and east-west, also, which is like typical of socioeconomic characteristic in Paris. So I have more maps here. This is, in 2014, and same trends, even if Nada lost election. This is Nida, Tunis, it's the convincingly reflects the, and I had the last one for you for the Arab Gulf. And that was fun also because we realized that the vote for Nada was high, of course, everywhere, but higher in Medine, Mecca, and small cities, and somehow, not so high or less high, and larger cities, Kuwait, Riyadh, Jeddah, etc. And not to speak of, Beirut, Amman, Damas. So I'll stop here, and thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Thibaut, and thank you to the three panelists for I think very interesting and very complementary presentations. It strikes me that all of them talk about change. All of them talk about evolution in time, but from different places, from different spaces, and also from different methodological angles. So it was actually very rich and a pleasure to listen to you. But yeah, there are already questions. Take a few questions in a row, and then a second round.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for that panel. Super interesting. My first question is to Nora. Thank you so much for your paper. I really enjoyed listening to it. You talked about from revolution to repression in the Berlin context. I was wondering whether you could make a distinction between state repression and societal, and whether you could talk about that a little bit. I mean, how much can we feel that repression from German society in silencing Palestinian mobilization, and how much was there actually solidarities, perhaps, even on a kind of civil society level, cafes supporting Palestinian causes, I'm thinking, like cultural. Yeah, I wondered whether we could, talk about that in the urban spaces, how that plays out between the kind of state society. Thank you.
Thank you very much for the very interesting contributions. I have a question to the three of you, because I found a line that was indirect between the three presentations regarding, and excuse me, I come from a performance background, so regarding the body and masses. We're talking about political engagement, and I've seen it, of course, I can see it vividly here in the room and also in Berlin, also in Munich, any other places where we have Palestinian diaspora protesting. There is visibility on their bodies regarding their narratives. And also in the case of the strike in front of the embassy, it's the use of the body to represent. In the case of voting, there's a mass, like a mass of body of people being measured here and there, how they have contributed. So how do you explain the body and the masses in terms of how do you describe the body in terms of the legitimization of the protest or of the political engagement from your perspectives, of course? Thank you.
Thank you very much. A question to Thibaut. I remember you presenting this at François Bourga's conference in Tunis back in 2012. So I think it speaks to how timely these things are continuously. So I think it's fantastic that you're back to this. Before I started my PhD, I worked as an elections observer, and I was part of the Tunisian elections, the municipal elections. And I was stationed in Paris, and I remember all these debates about, well, where are the ballot boxes going to be held? Or should we hold this in consulates, or these are Ben Ali holds, we should put them in schools, blah, 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 all that stuff. And this has gone away, right, since then. The stuff that you're talking about, the stuff that Laurie Brand was publishing, slowly this has gone away. So reflecting back, why is this? Because have elections become part of, like, have out-of-country elections become part of this transnational kind of legitimization of the regime? Is there something, is there another reason? Is it like, how can you reflect a bit on how things, on whether you'd be able to do this research now, and if anybody would care, essentially, to make it planned?
So maybe one last question for this round. Yes.
Thank you. Maybe just a quick comment and then a question. Thank you, Nora, for your paper. It was absolutely. I was thinking since this morning that up until you said re-traumatization, and maybe Thomas, when you said survivor guilt, but really quickly, there's like this element of the mental health toll of being in exile and migrant that I feel we've completely overlooked since this morning. We haven't yet engaged with what it means to have to go through this and then be in a host society where we're stuck into you're a migrant, you're an exile. And so maybe I want to go back to a question Nadim asked this morning. What research questions are useful today for post-2011 diasporas? Yes, but also to what extent are our research questions informed by avoiding re-traumatization, survivor-centered questions? How can we do better? Because we need to be doing better.
Thank you so much. All very interesting questions. I don't know, maybe you want to start, Thibaut, so that Nora can think about.
Yeah, it's a difficult question. I'll start by Gerasimo's question. It's a difficult question. It's true that when I was, hearing the presentation since this morning, I realized how much the context has changed since the last 10 years. Even in 2015, we were still hoping, that the Arab Spring would result in something that would be positive. Everyone still had a bit of hope, more and more Tunisia became the only country, where hope was still allowed. And even that one, eventually it collapsed. So certainly that, I guess that, I'm not sure anybody is actually working on external voting in Arab countries now. But certainly because of that reason, it has become, when it existed, now only an instrument, for regimes to legitimate themselves. And if it happens, yes, it doesn't really, has this meaning that it had at least in that moment. So it's more like, part of these policies and tools, from authoritarian state in order to control for the diaspora. So, wherever the ballot is held anyway, so it doesn't really matter if it's because the result, wouldn't be, the election is not sincere in itself. But still, I mean, as I said, we're never sure. I think, it's still a matter that we're, keeping it at least a bit in the and somewhere in our mind, because as I said, typically with the case of Syria, is an election, if an election is held at a certain point, the question of external voting for Syrian refugees will be there. This is obvious, Probably there will be a lot of money on the table from international organizations, the international community, to hold it. And it's important to have this in mind, because the last one, I mean, the similar one was Iraq, in 2005 was a fiasco. It was the most expensive, if you count, per voters, it was the most expensive external election. Like, money was really wasted by IOM at that time, who organized the election. And when you count of, how much it cost per elector, that was terrible. So I think it's important that in a post-conflict situation, refugees could participate, in an election. This is crucial. Then, it's up to, I don't know, the national community to discuss if this should be perenne and continue in the long term. If, citizens abroad are legitimate to participate in the governance of the country, but at least for the first one, if there's constituent assembly, then I would say yes. So I hope it answers the question.
Thomas, you want to go next?
Yes. So I think despite the fact that there has been a lot of repression, there has been also a lot of spaces opening up. And I think this is something also important to understand. At the same time, I wouldn't see that it's the general society. I think it's quite limited. I think it's also specifically diasporas or migrant communities which were also experience marginalization. So there you see quite a strong solidarity as well. So I think it's quite diverse, but I think it's as important to look at spaces of repression as much as spaces of solidarity that counter actually these forces. And maybe to the second question, I think the aspect of the body, and I think it's really an interesting question, because I think what happened in the context of the Palestinian diaspora, that there was really kind of a erasure of the presence, even in the context of Germany. So what I mentioned before, that you don't have, even when you look up the numbers, you have, as I mentioned in Berlin, I think the recent numbers are 800, but overall Germany, the statistics would say it's 6,000 Palestinians. And this is because Palestine as a category doesn't exist as much. Most of the times people are counted as stateless or as undefined or under the country they came from, for example, Jordan or Lebanon. And not to speak about also Palestinians who have German or Israeli citizenship or other European citizenship. So I think the embodiment, the visibility is also kind of a practice to kind of challenge this context of erasure, which kind of Palestinians experience since quite historically in the context of Germany. So it's kind of also, I would say intentionally kind of also a practice of diaspora mobilization, of diaspora activism, or those allies also of it. And I think it's something really interesting also when we think, and this connects maybe back to the next question or comment more, that we don't tackle a lot like embodied experiences, but also emotions. And I think I was really, really shocked when I was in one demonstration and I saw an activist from Syria with fear in the eyes who said, really, I'm standing here and I'm being transported back to the streets in Damascus. And I think we could explore also politics of emotion, both in the context of oppression. Here is used a lot in the context of Germany to actually hinder solidarity also when it comes to the Palestinian cause. But it's also important when we think about diaspora mobilization. I think also when we look at protests are not only spaces where you express your political position, but it's often also space where you can collectively heal, you can kind of connect also and bond. So I think, yeah, I would like to see more research on diaspora politics and emotions, but also I think you raised a really important question, how can we do it in a way that it's not re-traumatizing as well?
Thank you for the presentations. I have two questions for Thibaut about the external voting. I wonder if you have looked about the local dynamics that push, motivates, or hinder opening external voting. In Egypt, for example, in 2012 and before it, it was a big deal. Should we open it or no? Should we give the diaspora voices a voice or no? Especially in local political culture, if we can say, like the external voting is seen as like something that will confirm what is already existing, you know, the result that is already existing. Later way, the whole election scene is confirming what is already existing, but that's another issue. So that's what my first question is about, the local dynamics and politics of local dynamics. And second one is about, for example, what you presented about Tunisia, why we're only 6 consistencies, you said. Why not more? Why is it only about the numbers of the diaspora members in this particular country that decide we should open a box here or no, or there are other factors? Thank you.
Other questions?
I would have a question to Nora. With regard to Berlin, you do have in Berlin nowadays entire quarters of the city that are either called Syrian or Little Palestine. And I was wondering to what extent the presence of those diaspora communities in those areas should be seen as a form of engagement or resistance, or how do you read that?
Thank you. Thibaut, you want to start?
So to answer your question, I'm told that I have to be brief. So, but there's a lot to say on that. I haven't looked at Egypt in particular, but this question echoes to really, you know, what are the reasons for adopting and implementing external voting, and you know, what are the what is the, to what extent like domestic politics plays a role, and in that, in general, I mean, if people, you know, have a feeling that it doesn't really have an impact on local, you know, political balances, then it's fine. And in the case of Egypt, you know, diaspora had played such a role at the moment of the uprising that it was inconceivable, I think, that not to grant them the right, grant diaspora the right to vote. But in other countries, you know, it could actually be a blocking factor, you know, because, yeah, it doesn't has, it might change internal political balance. So in Senegal, for example, there's all the discourse about la diaspora fait l'élection, and, you know, if you want to know who is going to win, you look at, you know, how the diaspora is voting, supposedly, but there's a lot of discussion on that. So I'm trying to be brief, and a number of constituencies doesn't really matter much, because you're in a situation where it's, you know, it's in like a transnational world somehow, you know, they divide the world into different, like the circonscription, quoi, the different constituencies. It doesn't, so it's more a matter of how many diaspora representative you would have in the parliament. This is the one thing that matters. And the change in 22 was like lowering the number of representatives from 18, who was, you know, to 10, supposedly because, you know, and it's true, diaspora vote less. So if you count the number of, let's say, voters per representative, you know, a diaspora representative would represent less people than someone from the inside. And at the end, you know, 7 out of 10 representative Tunisian extraterritorial representative had not been elected because they were not
kind of candidate, enough candidate to, because of the condition, that the regime put in place in order to be candidate, you had to get 400 signatures, etc. So yeah, but the thing is, when you draw, France is drawing constituencies, also have the député de l'étranger, and there's a constituency for Afrique du Nord, another one, but it's weird, because there's no coherence somehow, or it's hard to have a coherence in the territory that you create. This territory, as yeah, this is the nice thing about it. It's a weird territory.
And you mentioned the presence in the city, such as shops, and I think that's something which also links back a bit to this entanglements of diasporic spaces. And I think actually that sometimes, at least I focus often a lot on activists, cultural workers, or organizations, but I think we miss actually a crucial part of actors who also contribute to diaspora mobilization. So I feel sometimes there's a quite elite focus. And what was interesting, for example, in the context of Sonnenallee, so it's the Arab street, it's a street where most Palestinian shops are, that in the first week in October, after the 7th of October, they organized a general strike. So all the shops, actually, and the general strike is also a historic kind of form of resistance from Palestine, and they organized it in the context of the Sonnenallee. And it was really many businesses, if not most, participating, and the whole street was empty and closed. No, so I think first there's also political organizing, which is maybe not always that visible when you talk to different organizations. But these places play also crucial roles. So the moment the ceasefire was announced, people went out to celebrate on the Sonnenallee, on the Arab street. The moment actually the Assad regime fell, they celebrated also in Hermannplatz and also other places, which is Oranienplatz, which also has a historic, actually, a history of also migrant organizing, refugee organizing. So places even within the city play a crucial role in how diasporas organize and mobilize. And I think, yeah, it comes back also to the question of positionality and who we speak to. And I think this comes back also to the context of emotion and the aspect of bodies. I think often we focus on the very visible political mobilization, whereas there's also much more hidden forms of practices that we often miss when we just focus on the registered organizations. Yeah.
Thank you very much. I think some of those more diffuse or elusive forms of mobilization will be touched upon this afternoon, unless I'm very much mistaken. So I think it's...
I think just on the political engagement, because I think Lebanon is a really interesting case to bring into the conversation, where in the last two elections, the Lebanese diaspora voted, and in the last one in 2022, their vote was actually determining of 7 out of the 128 seats. So it's interesting in Lebanon, for various reasons, I don't know if it will change in the future, diaspora votes where they are registered in their home villages or their hometowns. So they don't have special seats for the diaspora in Europe, in North America, and so forth. So they vote just like they were in Lebanon. Logistically, it's a bit of a nightmare, but the mobilization was key. And it was interesting to see that part of the reasoning why the diaspora insists that they don't want to vote for special seats for, let's say, representative for those in Europe. They say, look, our remittances are what's keeping our towns and villages alive. You know, the fact that I'm sending money to my family every month, I know exactly what's happening in my hometown. I know exactly the problem with the representation locally, the electricity, the level of services. So we should be considered as part of this sort of transnational citizen. And I think it's very interesting to kind of study. So Ari did 2 studies. We published 2 studies on our website on 2018, 2022. Whether this mobilization continues in future elections remains to be seen. But I think it has really strengthened practices of citizenship by the diaspora, levels of mobilization. It's also, the diaspora voted differently compared to statistics. They voted much more for parties of change, than actually people inside Lebanon. The diaspora, depending on the country, voted very differently. So in Germany, they voted very differently, and this has to do with sort of Lebanese dynamics. But I think, interestingly, it has legitimized, in a way, this form of citizenship. So just wanted to put it out there because I think it's a very it's another data point to kind of consider when we talk about how other models, and it'd be very interesting to see how Syria approaches this in the future, if and when there are elections.
Just take 30 seconds thank you for bringing that. It's actually close to my heart because my first interest to that question, external voting, came because I did my PhD on the state diaspora relation in Lebanon. At that time, it did not exist. It was a claim, and it was put forward mainly by Christian and even radical Christians, parties, because they hoped that, it would be in their favor, which didn't really materialize. It was connected to the issue of citizenship and those who left Lebanon even before its creation. So it's in Lebanon, it's a very interesting case. And yeah, thank you. So just stop here.
Thank you so much. I think we can all congratulate the three panelists for a very fascinating panel.